Hello, everyone, and welcome to another AHIF, the Africa Hospitality Investment Forum podcast, the podcast that looks to open the door and the windows on the investment community for the Africa continent. I'm here today with Thomas Emanuel, Senior Director at STR, and we're going to be talking today a little bit about a recent report released in partnership with AHIF, the title of which was Bridging the Gap. Welcome, Thomas.
Thank you very much, Matt. Good to see you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's good to see you again. So, first off, explain a little bit about this particular report and what it was there to do and find.
Sure. So I think this report was something we sort of wanted to release almost in the middle of the two AHIFs as such. So just a little bit of a taster, a little bit of an update as to what was happening from a performance perspective across Africa. Hopefully, as I say, sort of whetting the appetite for what's going to go on in Windhoek in June, highlighting some of the various markets. I'm sure we'll talk about that, just how varied a continent even Africa is, and give those, hopefully those that have attended in the past, but those that are thinking about attending as well in the future, a little bit of a taster of what STR will be there presenting in Windhoek in 6 months or so. So just sort of little mid-interval taster for what's happening across the region.
And so, from that, what were the findings? What does it sort of tell us about Africa at this point in time?
So I think it's, you and I have been working on this conference for a long time and working in Africa for a long time. And I think the first thing is, we always say it, but Africa is so diverse. Like you cannot generalize in any way, shape, or form. No two countries, even no two cities are performing the same. If we look at what's happening in Europe, you can kind of generally say, across Western Europe, this is happening or what have you. But Africa is a completely different situation, and I think that shines through straight away. But if we do try and look at things on sort of a bit more of a holistic level, just to sort of set the scene, the pattern from a performance perspective is actually a very, very familiar one for those that look at performance across the world. So what we're seeing is occupancy-wise, we're nearly there when you index on 2019, but not quite. And to give you some example, if we sort of just look at the north of the continent, year to date for September, it was 96% recovered. Southern Africa, 99% recovered. So we're pretty much there when you consider new supply coming into the market. The continent is sort of back pretty much to the levels that we saw prior to the pandemic. And of course, as we all know, 2019 was a bit of a stellar standout year for our industry as a whole. And then in terms of average rates, again, a very familiar story, considerably ahead of where they were. And that's obviously driving RevPAR, which again is well ahead of 2019 levels. So the good news is that the continent's back. And I think what's really important as well is if we look year on year, so obviously 23 versus 22, basically all countries bar, I think it was the Seychelles, are growing in terms of both occupancy and average rates. So that's a real promising thing. It shows that the market is going in the right direction. Demand is recovering further, growing further, and that rates are going up, year on year. So I think overall speaking, it's a very, very positive pattern in that regard. If we drill down a little bit more and look at some of the cities, again, it's really very diverse, as you would expect, but I think occupancy again pretty much there, and rates well ahead. And I think there are some standouts, which is always nice to be able to talk to. So in the north of the continent, Luxor and Sharm well ahead of where they were. I think that the one thing to mention there, 2019 is a bit of an odd comparison because there were some restrictions in terms of flights going into those markets at the time. But then moving to sort of sub-Sahara, Lagos has been doing amazingly well, going from strength to strength. Tremendous domestic demand really driving that market very, very well. Addis, which of course is a market that we've hosted, you've hosted AHIF in, I think, 3 times now. It just continues to go from strength to strength. growth is solid. We're starting to see more events coming into that market, which is something I highlighted um, back at the last AHIF in June.
Yeah.
Obviously, diplomatic capital of the continent, the economy growing, significantly. If you look at those biggest growing economies in the world, Ethiopia is always in the top 10, and it's absorbing the supply. Like, there's been so much supply that's gone into Addis over the last decade or so, and it just continues to absorb it, and the pipeline's still there. So Addis is a real, I think, star performer there. Nairobi's also doing really well. Again, a city, a regional capital as such, multiple demand drivers, corporate leisure, of course, the gateway to all the safaris, and we know how important leisure's been in the recovery. So another real good news story. And then, there are lots of other markets, particularly across the south, that are doing well. Kigali, Dar es Salaam, Maputo, Cape Town, Windhoek, all doing well. So plenty to be positive about. I think if we look,
Well, let's look at that.
sure,
Let's look at that a little bit. Look at Windhoek.
mm,
This is where we're hosting in
yeah,
June. What's their what's Namibia looking like? And let's dig a bit deeper into the SADC region.
mm.
Tell us a little bit about what's going on in the region.
So, I mean, I think Windhoek is, generally speaking, as I mentioned, it's a good news story. Metrics are ahead year on year. And it's back in line with where we were in 2019. So that's good. I think Windhoek, it's a smaller market, candidly, when compared to a lot of other African capitals. But it's got strong corporate foundations, without a shadow of a doubt. Very much, the center of Namibia holistically, and we do see, in other countries, obviously there are many centers, but I think Windhoek really is the center there. As I said, strong corporate demand, that very buoyant and very important mining and energy sector, which keeps that consistent level of demand coming in. And I think there's a growing tourism base as well. The country's got so much to offer, and I think the fact that the Namibians were so keen to get AHIF to the city as well, I think really, it says a lot. It says a lot about ambition and, how much they want to grow, and the fact that, getting, the predominant hospitality investment conference to the country was a big thing that they wanted to do. So I think Windhoek is a good news story, and I'm confident that it will continue to be. I mean, across the rest of that region, I mean, I mentioned previously, a lot of those good news stories were taking place across the Southern African Development Community. Of course, it's market dependent. We know that about Africa, and I mentioned that previously. But again, the same pattern emerges. Occupancy demand there or thereabouts versus that stellar 19 year, but growing year on year, and then average rates well ahead. And I think we see that across the board. The standout really, I think, Cape Town is doing incredibly well. It's had its issues over recent years, as we know, but ultimately, I think leisure is playing a big part in that. Of course, it's a hot leisure destination, and if we look across the world, those leisure markets have continued, have done really very, very well. We still talk about corporate demand returning, and it is, and it's pretty much back. But leisure's well ahead, so that obviously helps a market like Cape Town, which then also has the other demand drivers from the corporate and the MICE perspective as well. So, overall, I think that the southern part of the continent looks to be in a pretty solid spot.
Do you get? You mentioned obviously with Lagos being driven by the sort of local from a regional base. Are you getting the impression this is across Africa as well? Is there more involved? Is there more bookings coming from that community, or is it difficult to tell at this stage?
Well, I mean, at STR, we don't track the source of the guests, so I don't have any sort of empirical data as such to back it up. But I think what it is safe to say is and this has been talked about for a long time, the growing middle class in Africa, those that have more disposable income, are, it's only going to increase, right? That domestic or regional demand is only going to increase. I think, of course, generally speaking, where you see markets doing better in Africa, there's a nice mix of sort of that domestic and international demand base. But ultimately, yes, I mean, I think we're only going to see that as a source of business for African hotels increasing in the years to come as prosperity and disposable income becomes greater for a larger percentage of the population.
I suppose you mentioned Ethiopia and Kenya and the recovery in South Africa. What links those three is airlines. So in some ways, maybe that's the story there. But how does I mean, again, we can break Africa into lots of different pieces, so I get it. But how does now this picture fit in a global perspective from your experience?
I think Africa fits actually really neatly into the global perspective because it is in line in terms of where we've come back from. And I don't want to constantly harp back to 2019, but it is still, I think for this year, it's still an important comparison. I think next year we won't be looking back at that so much. It'll be fully year on year. But I think generally speaking, it sits neatly because what we are seeing is basically that demand picture is recovered. Supply has gone up a little bit, so occupancy is not quite as high as we might have liked, but it's pretty much where it was. And rates, just as we've seen right across the world, have gone up significantly. So Africa is actually very much in line with what we see in the global picture. There are some, like the Middle East, probably a little bit further ahead, but ultimately, it is in line. And I think that's a real positive because it is a very different hotel market to many others. As we know, it's not as mature, and but you did mention connectivity, which is vital. All of these cities that we talk about, you don't drive to them, you don't get the train to them. And if you look at Europe or the Americas, or the domestic demand volume in many countries across Asia Pacific as well, for example, it's a very different offering in many cases. So the fact that it has come back and it's come back quickly, particularly as we know airlift was slower to come back in many cases, I think is a real it's a real nod in the right direction and a bit of a vote of confidence. And I feel quite strongly that there's no reason not to be positive about 24 and beyond. There's always going to be events, situations that happen, and you can pick out, economic challenges at the moment in, Egypt and Ghana with inflation and things like that. There are pockets which are always going to be challenged, but of course you're talking about a massive continent with 54 different countries and everything that comes with that. But if we're talking about things, on a holistic basis, I think there's plenty to be positive about.
Well, I think it's a good moment to probably end the podcast for now. If you've listened to the podcast, you can actually pick up a copy of Bridging the Gap, the report, and we'll put some details on here for you to get that. But looking forward to Namibia. Looking forward to seeing the country as well.
Absolutely.
I'm going to spend a little bit of time there, which I think you are too. Obviously, a full update then, and thank you, Thomas, for joining us and giving us a flavour of what's going on.
Thanks very much, Matt.
Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in. For more information, visit our website at www.ahif.com.